Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Thinner by Stephen King. Now, Thinner was published in 1984, and this was originally published under King's pen name, Richard Bachman. Now, for those of you who don't know, early in Stephen King's career, he wrote several books under this pseudonym. Those books were Rage, The Long Walk, Road Work, and The Running Man. And this was the final Bachman book before it was found out that him and Richard Bachman were the same person. Now, he has written other Bachman books after this, but those were done more as jokes, whereas at this point in his career, he actually tried to make it look like him and Richard Bachman were two different people. And of all the early Bachman stuff, this is the one that really does feel like a Stephen King novel, because something you'll notice about the other Bachman books is they're so different from what you would normally expect from Stephen King. This is really the only one out of the early Bachman books that really does feel like a Stephen King novel, but it still has sort of that gritty, hard edge and that brutal sense of nihilism that you'll typically associate with the other Bachman books. One thing I will say, though, is if you're reading the original edition of this book that says by Richard Bachman and you have no idea that Richard Bachman is actually Stephen King, there are actually some hints in this book that you're actually reading a Stephen King novel, but I'll talk about those in a little bit. Now, if you couldn't tell from stuff like Creepshow or even Night Shift, Stephen King was a huge fan of the EC horror comics from the 1950s, stuff like Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear. Like, those comics were a huge influence on Stephen King growing up, and I would say of all his novels, this is the one where you really can see the EC influence. Like, if this were shorter, like if this were a short story, this would be perfect to adapt as a segment from a Creepshow movie. Now, the plot of Thinner is it's about this lawyer named Billy Halleck, who is a very overweight man, and one night while he's driving home with his wife ends up giving him a hand job, and he accidentally hits and kills this old woman who steps out into the road. He ends up getting off scot-free because he's actually friends with the judge who is presiding over his case. It turns out that this old woman was part of a traveling camp of gypsies, and the old woman's father ends up coming up to Billy and caressing his face, simply saying one word, "Thinner." And shortly after this, Billy starts to lose weight. Now here's the thing, he's not dieting or exercising at all, he's just randomly losing weight. And as his weight loss continues, it becomes apparent that he's not gonna stop losing weight. And as he gets thinner and thinner, his health starts to decline, and soon it becomes apparent that this old man put a curse on him. And he soon finds out that the judge and the lead investigator into the case have similar curses on them. And Billy now realizes that if he doesn't get this curse lifted, he's going to die. And that's the basic plotline of Thinner. But Thinner, I thought, was a great book. I personally do like some of the other Bachman stuff better. Like, I like stuff like The Long Walk and The Running Man a little bit better than this, but this was still a really good book, and I highly recommend it. And this is right up your alley if you like body horror. Body horror, for those of you who don't know, is a subgenre of horror where something horrible happens to the human body. Body horror stories are typically stories about the body turning against the host. Like, this is right up your alley if you like some of David Cronenberg's movies. Even though this isn't quite as cerebral as Cronenberg's stuff, I think you'll still enjoy this if you like Cronenbergian body horror. But once again, it also has sort of an EC-ish feel to it. Like, there's a lot of dark humor in this story, and the book ends on a very darkly ironic note, but also tragic as well, because I don't want to give away the ending, but let's just say at the end of the book, somebody who's completely innocent in all of this ends up paying for Billy's crimes. Another thing I like about this book is, normally in Stephen King's books, there usually is a defining good and evil. Like, a lot of his books deal with the concept of good versus evil, but here there really is no defining good and evil. There's no clear protagonist, and there's no clear antagonist. Now, you do feel bad for Billy in the beginning, because even though he made this horrible mistake, he was still a good person. He was a good father and a good husband, but he still should have probably paid for what he did, even if it was an accident, and the fact that he didn't, it really was sort of this justice that he got this curse put on him. But as the book goes on, you see how desperate he's becoming to get this curse lifted, and he actually does do some pretty despicable things towards the end of this book, which I won't give away. And throughout the book, he also develops a deep hatred for his wife, because it was also kind of his wife's fault as well. So in the book, you see what happens when this normally good person is put in this really desperate situation. Now, there's a certain point in the book where Billy gets the help of a friend of his named Richie Janilli, who is actually in the Mafia. And Janilli might have actually been my favorite character in this book, because he's a bad guy. I mean, he's a really, really bad guy, but he's still a three-dimensional character as well, because you can tell he does genuinely care about Billy, and he starts helping Billy, even though he knows these people could probably curse him the same way that they cursed Billy, but he's willing to go after them because he wants to help his friend. That, and he's also insane. But Janilli is a pretty cool character. And then you have the character of Tadas Lemke, I'm probably not saying his name right, who is this old gypsy who laid the curse on Billy. Like, at first glance, you could say he's the antagonist of the novel, you could say he's the villain, but he's also a very three-dimensional character as well, and you do understand why he put this curse on Billy, because this was his daughter who was killed. But the thing is, he doesn't seem to care that this was an accident. He feels that Billy still needs to pay one way or the other, and he does start blaming Billy for things that really aren't his fault, like how Billy's culture has treated his culture. But once again, even the supposed villain of the story is neither really good nor evil. And you also realize that even though he has some supernatural powers, he's still a human being and is still subject to human error. But Lemke is a really interesting character, because at one point in the story you find out that he's at least 106 years old, but it implies that he might be much older than that. Like, maybe he's actually some kind of quasi-immortal. Like, he's not exactly immortal, but you kind of get the implication that maybe at one point he performed a spell to prolong his life, because it does appear that he might be older than any other human being has a right to be. But once again, he's a very interesting character, and another thing I like about this book is it does play around with genre a little bit, because when Janilli enters the plot, it goes from being a horror story and actually becomes kind of a gangster story. But the horror elements and the gangster crime elements never really contradict each other, they actually complement each other. And there is actually some social commentary in this book. Like, you get this idea that when Lemke curses Billy, it's not just a revenge for the death of his daughter, but it's also sort of a cultural revenge. Like, he's taken revenge for the ways gypsies were treated throughout history. And Billy is not just paying for his own personal sins, but he's paying for the sins of his culture. And throughout the novel, Billy starts to really resent his own upper-class lifestyle, and he feels like that's part of what got him in trouble. And in typical Stephen King fashion, there is some commentary on the ugliness and the hypocrisy that hides behind the facade of small-town life. And there is actually some satire's not really the right word, but there is some commentary on American fast food culture. But once again, Thinner is a very good read, and I highly recommend this. And I just want to mention, in the book, there's this funny little meta joke where Billy's telling his doctor what's actually happening to him, and his doctor's like, that sounds like something out of a Stephen King novel. I thought that was pretty funny. Now, Stephen King wrote a fantasy series called The Dark Tower, which deals with the concept of other dimensions and parallel universes and alternate timelines. Now, the reason I bring this series up is because this series actually bridges together all of Stephen King's other books and short stories into the same multiverse, and this book is no exception. However, the Dark Tower connections in this story aren't as overt as they are in other stories. There's a moment in the second Dark Tower novel, The Drawing of the Three, where the character of Eddie Dean references a gangster named Janilli, who seems to be the character of Richie Janilli from this book. However, there is a problem with that, because this book takes place in 1983, and the parts of Drawing of the Three that dealt with the character of Eddie Dean took place in 1987, and I am going to give away this spoiler, but the character of Richie Janilli does die in this book, so it can't be the same Janilli that Eddie is referencing in Drawing of the Three. However, you gotta keep in mind that the Dark Tower series deals with the concept of parallel Earths. So maybe Eddie is not from the same version of Earth that this novel takes place in. However, in his universe, maybe an alternate universe version of Richie Janilli also exists. So maybe it is Richie Janilli, but once again, an alternate version of him. And also, it references how he's the owner of a restaurant called Four Fathers. Now, in this book, he owns a restaurant called Three Brothers, but once again, if it's an alternate version of Richie Janilli, maybe in that timeline, the restaurant is simply called Four Fathers. And if we assume that the Four Fathers restaurant that was referenced in Drawing of the Three is an alternate version of the Three Brothers restaurant, that restaurant is also referenced in Stephen King's novella, The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet. Another possible connection that I picked up on, now this is mostly fan speculation on my part, but in the book it kind of implies that Lemke, not only does he have some magical powers, and not only does he seem to have the power of prolonged life, but it also implies at one point that he has psychic powers, because at one point he says that he has the sight, and he's had the sight all his life, and since The Shining is also connected to Stephen King's overarching mythos, maybe Lemke is actually a shiner. Even if this book isn't set in the exact same universe that The Shining took place in, since we're dealing with a multiverse here, who's to say that the same psychic powers also don't exist in multiple universes? But once again, that connection is mostly fan speculation on my part. Now, this book was adapted into a film of the same name in 1996. The movie was actually directed by Tom Holland, who also directed movies like Fright Night and Child's Play, and he also directed a rather infamous Stephen King adaptation, The Langoliers. Now, I've never seen the movie in its entirety. I saw the beginning of the film when I was a little kid, and I actually saw the ending of the film when I was a teenager, but I've never seen, like, the middle portion of the film, so I can't really speak to how true or untrue that movie is to the book. I do know that movie got some really bad reviews when it came out, and it's still not a very well-liked movie, but it does seem to have a small cult following. Now, I was originally going to do this review with my friend Chris, but he couldn't make it today, so to make up for it, he sent me a short review that he did on this book. Now, Chris, I also reviewed Pet Sematary with him, and I reviewed Skeleton Crew with him. But here's my friend Chris's short review on Thinner. Real quick, just so you know, he sent me a voice recording that he did on his phone, and I have to say that the audio isn't the best. That's not really his fault. difficult, and I do hope you bear with it, because he has some excellent commentary on this book. Also, his review ended up being a little bit longer than I thought it would be, and there are some spoilers in his discussion on the book.
So Thinner is, with all intents and purposes, the last Bachman book, and Bachman really goes out swinging, because damn, this is really dark and really nihilistic, and it's just great characterization for what Bachman stood for. You know, it was King without the sentimentality. It was King with teeth, and that's why I really liked all his work, stretching through that. And it makes me sad that they figured out he was Bachman so early, because if they had not, I mean, we could have gotten a whole lot of Bachman books out of it. I mean, I remember Misery was originally supposed to be a Bachman book, and if you read it, it's almost like a Bachman book with a happier ending. It's almost like he took a step back and decided to do something lighter, which says a lot about his work. So Thinner obviously has a really fucked up, really gross premise at the center of it about basically this guy who gets cursed by a gypsy and just cannot stop losing weight after that. And the whole purpose of it really is kind of to elucidate just how fucked up we are in terms of, you know, the choices we make, the ill will we feel towards people, that kind of thing. And it's almost like in relationship to Pet Sematary in that way, because both of them are about fate, choice, and just bad luck, and how the three kind of bounce off each other, and how that affects us as human beings, and how we look at fate, and how we look at the things that control our lives. And I just love the ending, because it's not afraid to be dark. It's not afraid to admit that sometimes things just don't work out. And sometimes we gotta own up to our mistakes, even if, you know, it's not really our fault. I mean, the whole thing happened inadvertently. You can't really blame one sole person for any of it happening. Everybody was equally at fault in what happened, but at the end of it all, it did happen. And what sucks for Billy is that he was the one that was driving. So that just completely uproots his life, and unfortunately it means that he's the one that has to take responsibility for it, whether that be fate or whether that be just like a moral way of dealing with it. It's all Billy, and it's something that obviously, no pun intended, weighs him down. It's just such a fucked up idea, and King really shines in trying to be realistic about it, but also kind of elucidate just how horrifying the situation would be. I guess I should talk about the movie for a little bit. I do like the movie, but I don't like the ending, because it leaves the whole thing feeling incomplete, and it makes the whole thing, and I guess you could say it's sort of an expansion of the idea that Billy has really changed from this experience, and that he's become a much tougher, much meaner person. But for me, it just doesn't work as somebody who likes the novel. Richard, I think, is a really good character. He's a real fucker, but like, he's an honorable fucker. That was cool, and he meets what is implied to be a grisly death, and yeah, holy shit, that was an insane, like, double gut punch of an ending. Well, I guess lastly, I'll just say, if you look throughout King's work, obviously Bachman still shows up in certain other ways, whether it be the Dark Tower books, whether it be like offhand mentions and other stories. But I think if you really go through his bibliography and you look at stuff like short stories, and you pay attention to tone, you start seeing Bachman kind of swing through a few times. I think most of the short stories in Everything's Eventual, just about all of those are Bachman stories. Obviously, there was The Regulators, which was kick-ass. There was Blaze, which I think a lot of people weren't really into, but that was sort of like what Thinner was, almost like a more ruminative version of what Thinner was, like kind of like this short, to-the-point novel that just dealt with very direct themes. I wish we get more direct Bachman stuff, because it's King going outside his comfort zone, and like I've told Christian a bunch of times, I always love it when authors go outside their comfort zones and do stuff that's against type for them. King is known as a horror guy, but I feel like people who know him well know that there is like a positivity to his stuff. And Bachman is on the other end of the spectrum. He's more, I don't know if sadistic is the right word, but he's a little bit more ballsier, I guess I'll say. He's got an edge to him. And for that reason, yeah, I like Thinner. I highly recommend you check out the early Bachman books. Copies of it are tough to find. Stuff like Rage, Long Walk, Road Work. But if you find them, they're definitely worth your time, and they have this great insight into who King is as a writer and how he can be a different kind of writer. As much as his style might stay the same, his kind of tone and emphasis can change a lot. So definitely read Thinner if you haven't. I don't know how much between me and Christian we've spoiled for you, but trust me, it's worth it if you make it through the end. It's a short read. It's only about like 260 pages. And yeah, good little horror novel. I like Thinner.
Now I want to cut to another short review done by my friend Christian Feliciano, who used to do a lot of book reviews on YouTube. Unfortunately, he took down a lot of his old book reviews, but I'm going to leave a link in the description to his new YouTube channel because he just started doing reviews again. But here is his short review on Thinner.
Hey, voice in my head, what did you do this weekend? Oh, you're fucking disgusting. No, nothing I did this weekend involved midgets or Twinkies. Jesus fucking Christ, what the hell is wrong with you? I reread Thinner, what the hell do you think, goddammit? The book by Stephen King. Just shut the fuck up. Just shut the fuck up. That's what I'm about to get into. Anyway, so Thinner. Thinner is an interesting book because it was written by Stephen King, who at the time was using an alias Richard Bachman in order to do two things. Sell more books, and also to test to see if he was actually a good writer. Now, if you ask me, I think one of these was truer than the other. Despite my frustration with Stephen King's work, I really do feel like he is a man who cares about the art of literature and wants to be as good as he can get. So it really isn't that hard to believe that he would pull some crazy shit like pretending to be another author in order to see if he was popular strictly because of his talent.
But don't you do that yourself?
Shut the fuck up, we don't discuss that. Anyway, I happen to feel that Stephen King's best work, his absolute best writing, best storytelling, best plots, best everything, was done in the Bachman books, and Thinner is a perfect example of what I mean. Stephen King is really at the top of his game here. As I mentioned before, the Bachman books are the best he's ever written, and it's because of everything I see in this book. Fantastic writing, and I mean everything is great with the writing. The dialogue, the pacing, the overall building up of suspense. The characters actually feel like real people. And the descriptions, my God, the descriptions. Stephen King at some point said that if he can't terrify you, he'll give you a gross out. Which, when talking about this book in particular, I feel is a little disingenuous. Because this doesn't feel like he's trying to gross you out. Rather, it feels like he's trying to put you in the main character's shoes and go through what he is going through. Yeah, I usually prefer creepy atmosphere and such, which this book has, but the body horror can get under your skin, no pun intended. I mean, it did feel a little uncomfortable with the way some of it is described in the book, particularly with what the judge and another friend of his are cursed with. The judge is cursed with blotches of scales on his skin, and his other friend has horrible acne on his face, which may sound like nothing, but trust me, it is disgusting the way King presents it. And you could say, well, did we really need the body horror in this? I feel like we did. I feel like it was very important to have that in here because the story would not have worked any other way. Now, the surprising thing that I found in this book is that there's also a lot of humor in it. And the humor in this book works very well. Now, I don't know if this is intentional or not, but the story has a very Tales from the Crypt-like feel. It has a great mix of humor and horror, and no spoilers, but the ending I found to be fucking hilarious. Fucked up, sure, but hilarious. Overall, this book is fantastic. Anyone who is anyone should read it. Buy it if you can't buy it. If you can't afford it, go to the library and pick it up. I really mean it. I do not feel like you would be disappointed at all. This is definitely one of Stephen King's best books. And if you enjoyed this one, you'll definitely enjoy the other Bachman books. You know, Rage or The Long Walk or The Running Man, something like that. Those books are amazing, and I just love the Bachman books. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to my review, and bye-bye.
So I hope you enjoyed my friend's short reviews on this book, and that was my review on Thinner by Stephen King, and bye.